I catered Diddy's private party, and what I served that night still haunts me. It started like any other high-profile gig, fancy food, expensive clients, but I quickly learned it was much more than that. The dishes weren't just for dining. They were part of a ritual, a twisted feast for the gods. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I quickly became part of something far darker than just a meal. What I served, it was never just food. I was just a caterer. At least, that's what I told myself as I unpacked my gear, ready to cater another high-end event. But this job was different. This wasn't just a dinner party for some wealthy couple looking to impress their friends. This was Diddy's private event, a name that made my heart race, made my palms sweat. It was the kind of gig every caterer dreams of. A chance to work for someone at the top, to rub elbows with the elite, to be seen. I thought it was my big break. The phone call came late at night, around 10 p.m. I was lying in bed, still awake, scrolling through social media when my phone buzzed. The caller ID was hidden, always a red flag, but I was so eager that I didn't even think twice. Hello? Is this Alex? A deep voice asked on the other end. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. Yes, speaking. We need you to cater an event for Diddy tomorrow. It's private, no details over the phone. Just be here at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't ask questions, and whatever happens, don't speak to the guests, got it? I barely managed to get a word in before the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a few seconds. The instructions felt off, the secrecy, the urgency. But it was Diddy. I had no choice but to say yes. The next morning, I woke up to an empty kitchen and a pounding heart. The list of ingredients I was given was bizarre. Sure, there were the standard things you'd expect: lobster, foie gras, truffles. But then there were others that didn't sit right. Meats I couldn't identify. Rare herbs that smelled like something out of a dream or a nightmare. My hands trembled slightly as I laid everything out, trying to calm myself. This wasn't my first high-profile gig. I'd worked for enough wealthy, eccentric clients before. This time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But I had no choice. I needed this job. By the time I arrived at the venue, the place felt wrong from the start. It was in a secluded area, hidden behind high gates surrounded by dense trees. I had to pass through security checks, and they didn't just check my bags. They checked me. They looked at me like I was some kind of outsider. No, worse, like I was unworthy to even be there. But I pushed the thought aside. It was all part of the job. Celebrities and their egos. I was here to work, not to question anything. The kitchen was pristine, way cleaner than any kitchen I'd ever worked in. Everything had a place. Everything was shiny. The staff that I worked with were quiet. Too quiet. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't even make eye contact. They simply moved like machines, preparing for something big, something important. I tried to break the silence, asking about the menu, but one of the staff members, a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes, gave me a look that shut me up instantly. He turned away and kept working. That was it. No response. The chef, who, by the way, was the only person I spoke to during the entire day, didn't seem to mind my nervousness. He was already well into preparations when I arrived. His name was Diego. He didn't tell me much. In fact, he didn't tell me anything. The more I tried to engage him in conversation, the less he said. It was like we were all here for one reason, and one reason only: to cook, to prepare, and to keep our mouths shut. The oddest part was the smell. It wasn't just the usual scent of garlic and onions wafting through the air. It was something heavier, something that clung to the walls, something almost sickly sweet in a way that made my stomach churn. I'd worked with exotic ingredients before, but this felt wrong. My throat tightened every time I breathed in deeply, but I convinced myself it was the stress of the situation. Around noon, I caught a glimpse of some of the guests arriving. They were dressed in sharp, dark clothing, eyes hidden behind sunglasses. No one spoke to anyone else. They didn't smile or laugh. It was like they were here on business, and the party was just an afterthought. I kept my distance, unsure of what to say. There was an odd heaviness in the air. I looked around the room at the impeccable decor, the huge banquet table, and I started to feel a chill run down my spine. These people weren't just rich. They were something else, something unnatural. The way they carried themselves, like they were above everything. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew something was off. The first few guests took their seats at the table. They didn't speak to each other. There was no chatter, no pleasantries. It was as if they didn't know each other, or maybe they didn't care to. And then Diddy walked in. He was larger than life, taller than I imagined, commanding attention in a way that felt unnerving. But his smile was warm, his presence magnetic. For a moment, I almost forgot the strange vibe that hung in the room. The whole event felt staged, like it was all an act. But the thing was, I wasn't just an outsider. I had been invited into this world. They needed me here. I had a purpose, a role to play in this strange, mysterious night. What I didn't know yet was that the meal I was preparing wasn't just a luxury for the guests. It was a ritual, and I had been carefully chosen to serve. I didn't question it. I couldn't. It was just another job, and I was here to serve. But as the meals began, I realized this wasn't just about luxury food. It was something darker, something I couldn't yet understand. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me, but I pushed it aside as best as I could. I was here to work, to focus. Diddy's party was important, and this was my chance to prove I could handle the pressure. As I stood in the massive kitchen, my nerves began to settle, but they were quickly replaced with something else, something strange. The ingredients I had been given were unlike anything I had ever worked with before. I've seen some odd requests over the years, sure, exotic meats, rare spices, but this list was something else. Some things were familiar, lobster, truffles, and foie gras, but there were others. Things that had no place on a luxury menu. Things I couldn't even begin to recognize. I ran my hands over a package of meat, heavy and dark, wrapped tightly in plastic. I couldn't even smell it. It felt wrong just touching it. Like the kind of thing you'd read about in a horror novel, not something you'd expect in a high-end kitchen. Diego, the head chef, didn't say much, but he guided me through the preparation. The entire time, his eyes were cold. He didn't speak, unless it was to issue instructions. As I started chopping and seasoning, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. And it wasn't just the staff. It was something else, something in the air itself. A chill seemed to follow me around the kitchen. "Just follow the steps," Diego said, barely looking up from his station. "Everything must be perfect." His voice had that dead quality to it, like he wasn't really there with me. Just another ghost moving through the motions. The others, too, were silent, their hands working in sync with one another, preparing each dish with methodical precision. No one spoke. No one shared a joke or a smile. It felt more like an assembly line than a kitchen. I peeled back the layers of plastic from the meat, and my stomach churned. It wasn't just the way it smelled or the fact that it looked wrong. There was something unsettling about it. The texture, the color. It was too dark. The kind of dark that made you feel like you shouldn't be looking at it. As I cut into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were faint veins running through the meat, almost like muscle tissue still attached. I froze, my knife hovering over the piece of meat. The last time I'd seen something like this was in an anatomy book, when I had to study cadavers. This wasn't supposed to be food. This wasn't just meat. This was something else entirely. Something alive. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe the meat was just some rare cut I hadn't heard of before. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. Still, I pressed on. I couldn't afford to mess this up. It was Diddy's party, for crying out loud. And everything had to be perfect. But as I plated each dish, I couldn't help but notice how the staff moved in near silence and how the ingredients seemed to be placed with almost too much care. Like each dish was part of something bigger, something ritualistic. It wasn't until I started adding the final touches to the first course that the feeling in the room became almost suffocating. The smell in the kitchen had changed. It wasn't the familiar aroma of garlic and herbs. No, it was something much richer, heavier, something cloying, as if it was filling my lungs with every breath. I couldn't tell if it was the meat or something else in the air, but it was like my senses were betraying me. I looked over to Diego, who was quietly arranging the last of the garnishes for the main course. His face was as cold and emotionless as ever, but there was something about the way he moved that seemed almost ceremonial. Every gesture was precise, deliberate. Like he wasn't just cooking. He was performing a ritual, and suddenly, it hit me like a punch to the stomach. We weren't just cooking food. We were preparing an offering. Something meant to sustain. But sustain what? That thought made my skin crawl, and I quickly turned back to my own work, trying to focus on the task at hand. The kitchen door swung open with a soft creak. The staff filtered out in perfect sync, walking towards the dining area without a word. The smell of the dishes had already started to permeate the entire building. It was almost intoxicating. But it wasn't like any scent I had ever smelled before. It wasn't food. It was something deeper, something primal, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. One by one, the dishes were carried out. Each one, though beautiful in appearance, had something about it that made my stomach flip. When I glanced over at Diego, I saw him look at me for the first time. His eyes locked with mine, cold, lifeless, and he gave me the slightest of nods. It was as if he was telling me, without saying a word, that I was part of something far bigger than I could ever understand. And then, just as quickly, he turned back to his station and continued working. The guests had already started to arrive, and the party was beginning. I could hear their laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, and the sound of silverware against porcelain. But it wasn't comforting. It wasn't a celebration. There was something unsettling in the air, like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something darker than I could comprehend. I I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that I was a part of something I didn't understand. And as the first course was carried out, I couldn't help but feel a sickening twist in my gut. I wasn't just preparing food for a wealthy elite. I was preparing a feast for something else, something far more sinister. But even as the guests took their seats, I had no idea just how far this nightmare would go, or what it would cost me. The guests began to trickle in around 6 p.m., and with every new arrival, the atmosphere grew heavier. There was a kind of palpable tension in the air, something that made the walls seem to close in a little more with every passing second. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. I was a caterer, and I had a job to do. Still, it was impossible to ignore the strange energy these people gave off. I stood off to the side as they entered, trying to stay out of their line of sight. Just another shadow in the background. The first guest to arrive was a tall man, dressed in all black. His sunglasses stayed firmly in place, even though it was already dark outside. He didn't greet anyone, didn't even acknowledge the staff as he walked in. The rest followed in similar fashion, cold, distant, with an almost robotic quality to their movements. There were no handshakes, no greetings, not even a nod of acknowledgement. It was like they were all part of some unspoken pact, a pact I was still too naive to understand. I tried to convince myself that maybe they were just eccentric, maybe even above it all. But the more guests filed in, the more that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach grew. They all moved in a way that was too calculated, too synchronized. They had the same blank expression in their eyes, as though they were all lost in thought. Except it wasn't the kind of thought I understood. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. I watched as they took their seats around the long table in the grand dining hall. The setup was flawless. Expensive crystal glasses, delicate china, and the silverware arranged just so. Everything about the scene looked perfect, but there was something in the way they sat down that didn't feel right. They didn't laugh. They didn't talk. It was like they were waiting for something, or someone. Something that wasn't food. Something that wasn't a regular party. I caught a glimpse of Diddy as he walked in, a towering figure in a tailored black suit. His presence filled the room the moment he entered, and the guests straightened in their seats, as though by instinct. His eyes scanned the room, taking in everything with a predatory calmness. He didn't smile at anyone, nor did he make small talk. Instead, he made a beeline for the head of the table, his gaze never leaving the guests who were already seated. He didn't have to say a word for everyone to know exactly what was expected. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I could almost feel the weight of his power radiating through the room. Diddy wasn't just a celebrity. He wasn't just a businessman. He was something beyond that. His control over the room was complete. He didn't need to speak to command authority. He just had it. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just another dinner. This wasn't even just another exclusive party. This was a ceremony. And I had a sickening feeling that I was the one who had helped prepare it. The meat, the dark ingredients, the odd requests. They were all part of something far more ancient than I could understand. And the more I tried to shake off my paranoia, the more I realized I was in the middle of something dangerous. And I was powerless to stop it. As the guests sat, their eyes locked onto the table before them, unmoving. Not a single one of them dared to speak. It was as if they were waiting for the right moment, waiting for something. That didn't be long in this world. I stood by the door, silently watching as the waitstaff began to serve the first course. I was supposed to remain in the background, to not interfere, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was going on. Why did they all look so intent on their food? Why weren't they talking to each other? The tension was suffocating. Then came the most unnerving part of the night, their reactions when the food arrived. The moment the first dish was set in front of them, it was like a switch flipped. Their eyes changed. It wasn't hunger, not at first. No, it was something else. Anticipation, like they had been starved for something, not for food, but for something much darker. They didn't waste time. They didn't chat. They devoured the food, not with the typical refinement of people who dined in luxury, but with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. Forks and knives moved in unison, cutting into the meat with a predatory grace, as though they had done this countless times before. The quiet murmurs of approval as they chewed made my skin crawl, but it wasn't just their speed. It was the urgency. They weren't eating to fill their stomachs. They were eating like they needed to. Like this meal was more than just food. I couldn't take my eyes off them. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the table. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dishes weren't just there for luxury. They weren't even there for the guests to enjoy. They were there to sustain something. But what? I couldn't stop watching. There was a sickness growing in the pit of my stomach, a growing dread that these people weren't just indulging in food. They were feeding something much darker. I was caught between terror and curiosity, too afraid to move, too fascinated to turn away. It wasn't until I saw Diddy, sitting at the head of the table, watching the guests with an almost amused expression, that the truth began to piece itself together. His eyes weren't filled with the usual celebrity charm. There was something cold in them, something calculated. He wasn't here to celebrate. He was here to sustain. And those guests, they weren't just feasting. They were part of something I wasn't even close to understanding. The moment the first course was finished, there was no conversation, no cheers, no compliments, just a cold, silent nod, and the next course was quickly served. And as each course was devoured, I felt the air thicken, suffocate me. This wasn't just about food, but what I didn't know was that this meal wasn't just about indulgence. It was about something far darker, something that I was now part of. I thought I had seen it all. I thought I could handle anything this party threw my way. But as the first course was placed in front of the guests, I felt something shift in the air. It wasn't just the richness of the food. It wasn't the perfect presentation. It was the way the guests stared at the dishes in front of them, like they were waiting for something. And then it happened. The moment the dishes were set down, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. The weight of it hit me like a wave. They weren't just eating, they were devouring. The plates were filled with elegant, meticulously prepared dishes. Steaks, fish, sauces that shimmered under the soft lighting. But as I watched them, I saw something I wasn't prepared for. The guests didn't take their time to savor the food. They didn't even look at it properly. They attacked the plates as if they hadn't eaten in weeks, as if they were starved beyond reason. The fork went in first, digging into the meat with a force I couldn't comprehend. The knives followed in synchronized rhythm, cutting through the flesh with unnatural precision. It was like they were ravenous, like they couldn't get enough, but there was no satisfaction in their faces. There was no pleasure in the taste. Instead, there was something darker, something insatiable. My hands were trembling. I had to force myself to look away, but every time I did, I found myself glancing back at the table, unable to stop myself. There was something hypnotic about the way they ate. It wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. The guests barely spoke. The only sound in the room was the clinking of utensils on plates, the occasional murmur of approval, and the soft rustle of napkins. It wasn't a conversation. It was more like a ritual. The guests didn't need to talk to one another. They didn't need to exchange pleasantries. They were all focused on the same thing: the food. And the food wasn't just about eating. It was about something else. But what? I glanced over at the kitchen door, hoping for some kind of explanation, some sign that this wasn't as strange as it felt. But Diego, who had been so cold and distant all night, was watching from the corner of the kitchen, his eyes flicking between the table and the preparations for the next course. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression was all I needed to see. He was watching. And he was waiting. It wasn't until I heard the faint whispers from the guests that I began to understand. They weren't talking to each other, not really. They were speaking in hushed tones, just loud enough for the others to hear. "The gods will be pleased," one of them said, barely audible above the silence. Another guest nodded, his voice just as low. "We feed them tonight." A shiver ran down my spine. It was the first time I'd heard any of them speak in full sentences. But the words, they didn't sound like normal party chatter. They sounded like a ceremony. And that was when the sinking feeling in my stomach became unbearable. The guests weren't just eating because they were hungry. They were offering something. But offering to who and why? As the guests continued their meal, the unease in my chest grew. Every bite they took seemed to make them more agitated, more desperate. They couldn't get enough. The plates, which had once been filled with rich, decadent food, now sat empty in front of them. They hadn't even taken the time to appreciate the quality. It was like they were devouring not just the food, but the life force itself, the very essence of what was in front of them. And the worst part? I couldn't stop watching. I wanted to turn away, to walk out of the room, but I was frozen in place, caught in this strange trance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see, something forbidden. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears faster with every passing moment. The weight of the silence was unbearable, and yet the guests didn't seem to mind. They didn't need to speak, didn't need to acknowledge one another. Their attention was focused entirely on the meal. I took a step forward, unable to stop myself, and saw one of the guests lick their fingers. An unsettling, almost animalistic look on their face. My stomach churned. This wasn't just indulgence. This wasn't even gluttony. This was something far more primal, something I couldn't explain, something that filled the room with a suffocating, unnatural hunger. And then, as if on cue, they all stopped. They placed their forks and knives down at the same time, their gazes still locked on the empty plates in front of them. A silence descended upon the room, so thick that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Diddy stood, breaking the tension with a single, slow clap. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it soon grew louder, his hands resounding through the space like the beating of a drum. The guests stood too, their movements synchronized as they clapped in rhythm with him, as if this was ritualistic, a ceremonial offering, a tribute. The room was still except for the sound of their hands clapping in perfect harmony, creating a rhythm that was both unsettling and hypnotic. I stood frozen, unsure of what I was witnessing, unsure of my place in this whole thing. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, each second dragging like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then, Diddy turned to me. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time that night he smiled. A slow, knowing grin. I wanted to look away, to run, but I couldn't. His smile sent a shiver through me, the kind of smile that made you feel like you were part of something you didn't understand, something you would never escape from. And then he spoke, his voice smooth but laced with something dark. "It's all part of the ritual," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "We feed, we give thanks, and we sustain. It's what keeps us strong." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I suddenly understood. They weren't just guests. They weren't just people. They were part of something much darker. And I had just unknowingly served as a vessel for something beyond my comprehension. I took a step back, my pulse racing, my mind reeling. I needed to get out of there. But as the clapping continued, I realized something far worse. I was already part of it. But the worst part was yet to come. Because what I'd seen wasn't the worst of it. It was just the beginning. I couldn't look away. Even after the applause had died down, even after Diddy's cryptic words had settled in my brain, I was still frozen in place. The guests resumed their seats. The tension in the room still palpable. But now, it was more intentional, more purposeful. They had all turned their attention back to the empty plates in front of them, waiting for the next course. There was a dead silence, like the calm before a storm. I stood there, heart pounding, 1,000 questions racing through my mind. The food, the guests, the strange words they spoke. It wasn't just a dinner. It was something ritualistic. But what was it? What had I unknowingly participated in? What had I served? It was then that I heard the quiet whispers again. This time, I couldn't ignore them. They were no longer just murmurs. They were intentional, purposeful. The guests spoke in hushed tones, but their voices were charged, as though they were reaffirming something ancient, something dark. One of the guests leaned forward, speaking softly, but with a sharpness that cut through the air. "The sacrifice is made. We feed them, we sustain them, and they will keep us strong. This meal, it isn't just for us. It's for the gods." My stomach turned. My skin crawled. I felt the world tilt beneath me, like the ground was suddenly unsteady. Sacrifice. Gods. This wasn't just a rich, decadent dinner. This was ritualistic, like they were performing some kind of twisted ceremony to appease a dark force. And I had been part of it. I had prepared it. I had helped set the table for a sacrifice, a feast that was about much more than just food. I glanced over at Diego, who was still in the corner of the kitchen, watching the room through the open doorway. He wasn't just a chef. He wasn't just here to cook. He was part of it, part of the ritual, part of the cult. I could see it in his eyes, that cold, emotionless stare. He didn't care about the food. He didn't care about the guests. He cared about something else, something unseen. As the next course was brought out, I saw the guests' faces change once again. Their hunger wasn't just physical, it was almost spiritual. It wasn't a craving for pleasure, it was a need. They ate like they were starving for something beyond sustenance. It wasn't just flesh they consumed, it was power. The power of the sacrifice, of the ritual. I couldn't help myself. I leaned closer, trying to hear more of what they were saying, hoping to understand just what was happening around me. But it wasn't enough to just hear the whispers. No, now I needed to see it. I needed to understand. As the meal progressed, the guests didn't even acknowledge me. I wasn't there. I was invisible. Just another face in the background, a shadow against the walls as they indulged in their dark feast. And the more I watched, the more I realized how deep this went. This wasn't just a meal. This wasn't even just a ritual. This was a sacred act. I noticed one of the guests, a woman with dark, hollow eyes, muttering as she cut into her meat. We offer ourselves. We offer them, and in return, we are kept strong, kept alive. Her voice had a reverence to it, an almost worshipful tone. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about feeding. This wasn't about eating it at all. It was about feeding the gods, maintaining an immortal power that stretched back generations, and I had just become part of it. My pulse raced as I looked around at the others. They were all in on it, every single one of them. And I, unknowingly, had been chosen to play a part in this horrific feast. My hands began to shake, my throat tightening. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I wasn't just a caterer. No, I was complicit. I had fed them. I had served the offering. The guests continued to eat, savoring the dishes, each bite adding to their power. I could see it in their eyes. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something darker. They were feeding on more than just the food. They were feeding on souls, human essence that was being consumed with each piece of flesh, each mouthful of the unholy feast. They weren't just indulging. They were sustaining themselves, and each bite was keeping them alive, keeping them immortal. Suddenly, Diddy's voice rang out, breaking my spiraling thoughts. "It's a gift, you know," he said, his voice smooth, cold. "We've been feeding the gods for generations, and they keep us strong. They keep us alive." I froze. He knew. He knew I was listening. He knew I was starting to understand. But it didn't matter. I was too far gone. I had already been marked. I was part of the ritual now, just as much as they were. The last course was brought out, the final offering. The air was thick with anticipation. I watched as the guests consumed it with an almost ferocious need. They didn't stop to talk, to look around. They didn't need to. Their bodies were consumed with the hunger. Their souls starved for something beyond this world. And I realized, with growing horror, that the food wasn't the only thing they were devouring. They were feeding on each other's energy, their souls. The meal wasn't just a way to gain physical strength. It was a way to feed the gods, to keep them alive, to ensure their power never faltered. And the worst part? I had just fed them. I had served the offering that was supposed to sustain them for another year. And now, there was no going back. I was already marked. I was already part of the ritual. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, but all I could hear was the sound of the guests chewing, the clinking of their silverware, the satisfaction in their eyes. They were immortal, and I had just given them the strength to stay that way. And the worst part? I realized that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much darker path that I could never escape. The silence in the room after the last course was unbearable. The guests sat still, no clinking glasses, no chatter. They stared ahead, unmoving. I stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. My stomach churned as I realized I was no longer just a bystander. I had been part of something terrible, something dark. The guests didn't leave. They didn't thank the staff or even acknowledge us. They just waited, waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. My hands shook as I wiped them on my apron, trying to hold myself together. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. A dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled, clutching a chair for support. My vision blurred, my head spinning. Was it the stress of being surrounded by so much power? Or was it something else, something more insidious? Then I felt it. The eyes of the guests were on me, cold, empty eyes. The hunger in them was unmistakable. It wasn't just curiosity. It was predatory. They weren't satisfied by the meal. They were feeding on something else. Me. Diddy's eyes met mine across the room. He smiled slowly, a knowing, predatory smile. His gaze cut through me like a blade. In that moment, I knew. I was part of this now. I'd crossed a line. I wasn't just a caterer anymore. I wasn't an outsider. I had become part of the meal, part of the sacrifice. I felt it crawling under my skin, the hunger. It wasn't just physical. It was a force, something ancient, something darker settling into my bones. The guests weren't the only ones feeding anymore. I was changing. My legs felt heavy, my breath shallow. The air was thick, suffocating as if the walls were pressing in. I staggered back, desperate for air, but the room seemed to close in on me. The guests' faces had turned hollow, drained of life. Their eyes were vacant, empty shells. They had consumed more than just food. I looked around, my mind racing to make sense of it. This wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about indulgence. The food, the ritual, it was all part of feeding something else, something evil, ancient, hungry. I tried to reach the door, desperate to escape, but something pulled me back. A force, invisible but strong, yanked me away. I turned, and there they were, the guests, standing in unison, their eyes fixed on me. Diddy's smile grew wider. His voice was calm, almost soothing. You're part of this now. You've fed the gods, and now you will sustain them again. The curse had already taken root. I felt it spreading inside me, gnawing at my insides, deeper than hunger, more insatiable. I was no longer human. I had become part of the feast, part of the ritual. I realized the truth. There was no escape. And the worst part? This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far worse, something I would never escape. I didn't just serve food that night. I served a curse. The moment I stepped into that room, I was marked, chosen to partake in something far darker than I could ever understand. The hunger, it's inside me now. Every day it grows, clawing at my insides, demanding to be fed. The guests, they're not gone. They're still here, living off the feast they devoured. And now, I'm one of them. Every time I look in the mirror, I see it. The emptiness in my own eyes. I'm becoming part of the curse. I can feel it in my bones. The hunger is endless. The hunger will never stop. And I know, deep down, that someday I will feed. I will join them, a part of the cycle that never ends. No matter how far I run, the curse follows. And now, it's too late.